All right, you're welcome along to the latest episode of Keith Wood's State of the Union. Keith is here as always, and I'm Nathan Murphy, sitting in for Ger Gilroy this week. We have a brilliant panel today. It is always a privilege to have a World Cup winner on the show, and Maggie Alphonsi is just that. Successful at England back in 2014. Maggie's now a member of the RFU Council. Ali Donnelly is the founder of the hugely popular Scrum Queens and is also communications director at Sport England. And Wendy Keenan, who has many roles within Irish rugby, including being chair of the Munster Women's Committee and also sitting on the IRFU's Women's Committee. So Keith, the future of the women's game, the focus of today's episodes, and I guess while we are now very much entering the harsh economic impact of COVID-19, the one overarching theme of the series so far is that while COVID-19 is going to have huge ramifications for the sport of rugby, most of the issues that you've been discussing and that we want to discuss, they were there even before the crisis started.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. There have been many issues, and we have taken the opportunity over the last few weeks in lockdown to pause and reflect and look for the differing opinions and also information on the State of the Union on the game that we all love. We don't have all the answers. In fact, we've been looking for the right questions in relation to rugby. And the main governing question we have is, if there is now a reset, what would we do differently if we had our time back again? So Maggie, I might ask you first, actually. What was the State of the Union in the women's game before this crisis?
So I guess pre-COVID, I would like to say that the women's game I thought was growing, but there were still concerns around the women's game developing and growing globally. So, in places like, I can only really talk for England, I guess. In England, it was pretty strong, as you can see with the Tyrrell's Prem 15, having a set of strong teams competing out on a regular basis, the scores being relatively close, but developing a very strong national side, and the England team, winning quite a lot of their international games. So from the English perspective, you'd say the game was pretty strong going into COVID. Coming out of COVID, I'd almost say I'm a little bit uncertain by what's coming ahead, especially when I look at the, top flight game with regards to the Premiership. We have no sponsor at the moment. They're ending their sponsorship at the end of their 3-year contract, so it's Tyrrell's, and you need big sponsors, I personally feel, to ensure that you're growing the game but also pushing the reach of it in terms of its visibility. So that's still waiting to be confirmed, and once we get a big sponsor, then I think I'll be a little bit comfortable in that sense. But at the same time, I think COVID has affected all women's sports, and we've become pretty much a afterthought. And I think that's been my concern. When is the women's game going to start again? It's pretty much thrown into the community game anyway. So when is it all going to start again? And when it does, we need to have certainty behind sponsors, and that we're going to still have the same support that we had prior to the COVID.
And even if we're to look back on it as what it was like before COVID, was it sustainable on its own? Was women's rugby sustainable on its own?
It'd be great to get everyone else's perspective on this one, so I can only talk from my own perspective. I don't think it's sustainable on its own, no. I think it really needs the help of, collaborating with men's sides in particular. So one of the things that Tyrrell Prem 15 did quite well was that you're starting to see the support from the men's, program. So, for example, if I look at Saracens, I know there's been a lot of controversy there, but there's been support from their side to help the women's program. We've recently heard about Exeter, they're joining the Premier 15's league next season. Same with Sale as well. So, that's massive. So it's not a standalone thing. We definitely need support with the aim that one day we will be standalone. But I have to say the collaboration is what's key for our sport to grow.
Okay, and Wendy in particular, what could you give me an idea of the structure within Ireland?
Okay, so our landscape is a little bit different, Keith, in relation to the effect of COVID has. But if we look at the structures within, I suppose each of the provinces has their women's committee, which feeds into your rugby committee, and usually the chairs would sit on the branch committees as well. The chairs and the youth representative then would also sit on the IRFU women's subcommittee. And we would meet quite regularly and feedback there. And our Women in Action plan provides a platform, I suppose, for us to have a structured format for reporting back in terms of statistics. in relation to that. And then Mary Quinn, who is the chair of the IRFU Women's Subcommittee, is also opted onto the IRFU committee, and she would also sit on the rugby committee there. In terms of, I suppose, the effect that COVID will have on our club structure, we were already going through a restructure in relation to developing the game, and our AIL had been expanded to 10 teams. So there was the introduction of 2 new teams to start in the coming season. While of course it has had a huge financial effect on all teams, both boys, men's, and the girls and the women, you know, I hope that there's a lot of positives, and this has given time for clubs to reflect and to plan for the future. We've been doing a lot of work, you know, contacting teams, looking at our development squads, staying in touch with players, you know, on an online platform. And one thing that we have done, I suppose, from a Munster perspective, is formed a document, a club support document, so that it's almost like a health check for clubs, you know, where we want to integrate the girls and the women's rugby fully into the clubs, where that mightn't happen in all clubs. So it has given us time, I suppose, to do that and look at our practices and look at what best practice and start to introduce those.
Just in relation to both the UK and Ireland, if you were starting again, would you start where we are now, or would you do something different? I know there was a conversation in Ireland that maybe Ireland might go along a county system, almost like a more GA system than a club system, rather than copying exactly what happened in the men's game previously. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a place for both. I mean, it does happen in the GA. I know that there are people who support that viewpoint and people who are against it. From a Munster perspective, we're incorporating both for the coming season. We do have an issue with our adult playing numbers. I mean, that's where we have a huge drop-off rate. And while we're growing the numbers at underage levels, we are seeing a fall off, and that's an area that we have to tackle. So to create sustainable clubs and a pathway, I suppose, for clubs to have players going from the youth section all the way through to adult level, we are now forming, if you like, a county team. The example I would give is Kerry. So we have 4 clubs who have strong underage structures but struggle at the adult game, and for the coming season they're going to field like essentially a county team into the Munster League. It'll be a first for us, it'll be a first in Ireland. You know, we'll support the clubs through there. We have the agreements in place in relation to the clubs. We're also doing it on an East Munster basis as well, and we're going to try it, we're going to see how it works, and we believe that if we support that structure that we might be able to replicate that in other places around the county. I mean, Munster has its own problems. We're logistically a very big province, so travel does become an issue. So, and you know, there's a cost associated to travel. So it's hard to say whether we should go back and look at the county team. We have some very successful clubs. If you look at UL Bows, one of the best teams in the country, they're sustainable, you know, in an entity on their own, so they wouldn't need that county structure. So there might be a place for both, which reflects what happens in the GA.
And Ali, if I could ask you the same question, would you change things an awful lot if you were to start again?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you're getting to here is about innovation, and can the women's game actually use this opportunity, i.e. this reset, for want of a better phrase, to try and do things differently. And it's a question I think that is starting to be asked a bit more as the women game grows and develops across the unions that are investing into their women's programs. You know, what is right for women's rugby, not what's right for rugby. And so, yeah, there are definitely things we could do differently. But I suppose the point I would make generally, just, you know, reflecting on what Maggie and Wendy have said, you know, the women's game, the momentum in the women's game was only going in one direction pre-February. And, you know, it wasn't just COVID, by the way. The weather was also a really difficult factor for women's rugby in February. So most of the Six Nations, for example, got cancelled. Scotland, I think, played 2 matches, partly because of the weather, then COVID, and some of their players got it. So you know, it was going in one direction. It got sort of chopped off at the knees because of a couple of different things. But that momentum there, I think, is something to be really optimistic about. But you know, the question, what can women's rugby do differently as a result of this? Well, we should be thinking about, and we're going to have to now. So the, you know, World Cup qualifiers have been cancelled in September. So, you know, who knows when Ireland will get to play again. So World Rugby and all the organisations who are involved in the women's game do have now an opportunity to look at different structures and different formats. And I think most of them are doing it. I mean, the other challenge that we have in the game, and this is a challenge regardless of COVID, is that for so long, women's rugby has been sort of, you know, chasing its tail in terms of the game. So, you know, I was sort of looking up some research about why we were so far behind in terms of commercial investment. And I was reminded that in Ireland, right, this is an Irish podcast, so I'll use an Irish example. The first men's test game in Ireland was in 1875. First women's test game was in 91. And if I could do my maths properly, there's a 116-year difference there, right? So the women's game has been catching up for decades in terms of investment, commercial opportunity, etc. And it isn't, you know, you asked Keith, is it sustainable on its own? No, it's not. Of course it's not. Partly because of that, but also the game of rugby isn't sustainable. I mean, look at the Premiership here. Most clubs are losing money hand over fist. So I think what we do have is a great product and a great opportunity to make it sustainable if it is sold correctly. And I guess we can get into the conversation about sponsorship and selling in later, but it's just a really interesting time to be involved in the women's game.
Well, I think we can go into that almost straight away because it's a perfect little link. But like I often compare rugby from 1990, 91, 92 when I started. So when I started with AIL and when I started in the Ireland squad, when there was no payment for games, when there were no sponsors, when there was no rights being paid by television companies for it. And there's a huge similarity at that stage. So that's only 30 years ago. And in that period of time, it's gone and ramped in that direction. Is that growth potential there for the women's game? And if not, why not?
Yeah, why not? Anything is possible right now, I think, particularly because, you know, not just women's rugby on its own, but there is a huge momentum around women's sport and participation in women's sport that is there to be sort of capitalized on. And I agree, there are definitely some overlaps at what was happening as the men's game went professional to what's happening in the women's game now. And we do need to learn, you know, some lessons from that, although times are different. So in the women's game, you've got real kind of, Maggie alluded to this earlier, some slightly worrying, you know, variables. You've got a fully professional England team, a semi-pro France team, and everybody else is amateur in the 15s game. So that is creating some really challenging anomalies and gaps that are going to be very hard to close, I think. But you're right to make the link because we are at a similar stage, I think.
But I remember back, even my first year in Quins, we trained in the evening time and we were professional. And it was very interesting because the coaches said, we have you now, we can train you 3-4 times a day, which you can't, of course, but also there was a huge pressure that kind of went to the guys who wanted to continue to work and to the guys who wanted to play fully. A lot of the guys, they would have earned less money and had less potential going forward if actually they'd gone professional. So is there a big urge, is there a big drive for the game to be across the board professional, either at an international level or at a club level?
I don't know if Maggie wants to come in because she will obviously have more kind of links to players, but some players don't want to go professional. In France, they decided to go semi-pro because the cap on what you can earn in the women's game is pretty low. The England women's players who are contracted are earning max 30k. Yes, they can add some money on top of that, but if you're a doctor or if you're an accountant or whatever, you'll be losing 50, 60 grand. So I think it's back to the point, what's right for the women's game?
Maggie,
I guess,
any thoughts?
Yeah, just coming back in on that, because I guess when I was playing, I remember at the time that from the outside, everyone wants the women's team to be professional, to be just like the men. And as a player, you think, yeah, I really want to be professional. And at the same time, the opportunities in terms of finance are so significant. You know, to go professional for us was going to be quite low in terms of how much money you're going to get, where I could quite happily get a job, you know, as head of development and make quite a large amount of money, including bonus. And that's quite a big decision for a player to make. And now that you're seeing in England in particular, the players have gone professional, I think a lot of players are happy to be professional, of course, because it's something that we've strived for such a long time. And from the outside, the world is pushing it. The world wants the women's team or women's sport to be professional. If we were looking at the detail, though, if you think about the options that some of those players have had to make in terms of, do I pursue a career, as Ali's already highlighted, as a doctor or as a lawyer, where I can make a large amount of money and also really establish my career? Or do I take the risk and hope that I play for my club and hope that I can really do well for England and hope that that career is long? It's such a big risk. So I think players have to be professional, but there's a real press that we need to make sure that the women who are professional are getting, and I'm not going to get exactly the same what the men get, but they need to be getting a lot higher in terms of how much money they get paid, and the benefits that they get paid have to be good as well to ensure that the balance equals out.
Go on, sorry, Nathan.
Sorry, I was just going to ask Ali, from your role within Sport England, you're probably seeing a lot of the data around participation figures in women's rugby, particularly at an underage level. And I'm wondering, that professional endpoint, is that an important factor in participation numbers, in keeping young girls involved in the game, that having that goal of, well, I can go on and while there are other options, I can make a career of this. This is something I can enjoy and make money out of into my 30s. Does that factor into participation numbers at all? Or do you expect it to?
What factors more is visibility. And so obviously if you are a professional, you have more visibility. And so visibility is really important, particularly for younger girls taking up sports. And you know, that's one of the concerns of today, actually. I was tweeting about this yesterday. We got the Premier League back today. And I looked at every single, because I'm up early. I have a 3-year-old who likes to get up pre 6 a.m. I was looking at the sports websites this morning, and you would be hard pressed to find a women's sports story there today, because there, you know, we're not playing. No one is playing anything. So visibility is more of a, you know, push into more of a factor in participation. But on the growth point, I would just say, I make this point all the time, and I think it's really important. In the game of rugby, women and girls rugby in almost every nation, is particularly the tier 1 nations that we know, traditionally called tier 1 nations, is the only growth area. Adult male rugby is in decline in many of the major nations around the world. So strategically, you know, that investment in sort of growing the game at grassroots level, whether it's visibility that helps to drive it, or it's genuinely money and time and strategy, it's really important for NGBs at the moment. So that's quite interesting. And that gives me a lot of hope, because you can't ignore the one growth area of your sport.
No, and that was one of the points, Ali, as well, I was going to touch on. And I think we had in one of our previous conversations, was whether you would want to have your own national governing body, or whether you want to be you are part of rugby, you want to stay part of rugby, you want to be the key driver for the growth of rugby.
Yeah, I mean, my view on that is that from a community and grassroots amateur side, yeah, of course, you need that's what NGBs are there for, right? They're there for everybody who plays rugby, whether you are someone with a disability, you are, you know, female, male, you know, young, old, whatever. I think where would get really interesting, we're not there yet, is when the competitions element becomes a real factor. So Maggie referenced the Premier 15s here. You know, the same model happens for other sports. So when it comes to professional competitions and leagues, is the union the right place to drive the sponsorship and investment? Are they actually the experts, or is it another body driven by commercial you know, revenue? So in the same way that Premiership Rugby run the competitions here for the men's game, but the RFU or the NGB, is that an interesting model? And that happens in other countries. So, you know, the WNBA run the professional basketball league for women, but there is a body that run basketball for America. You know what I mean? So I don't think we want to go back to the days where there's a separate committee running the women's game. So I don't know, Wendy, if you were on it, but I was certainly on the IWRFU committee. You know, when it was running the women's game, and you're just so hamstrung by infrastructure and resources. So no, I think all together to grow the grassroots and community game, but there's definitely a debate to be had about what happens at competition, you know, when the competition is really generating interest.
Yeah. I think just to add to that, Ali, I mean, we worked hard for integration to come away from the IWRFU and to have full integration with the IRFU, and it, you know, it gives the positive standing in relation to, you know, the development of the game. So I would see them incorporated. I can't see us separating out, you know what I mean, after developing those structures and securing funding, especially with our Women in Rugby Action Plan, you know what I mean, which guarantees us, you know, funding for the game, for the development of the game and the growth of the game. I suppose in Ireland we're in a very different position to other countries, and we can aspire to be professional, you know what I mean, like France and England, but we're not there yet. You asked an important question there. Do you know, dream of being a professional rugby player? I'm sure if I spoke to a 14-year-old who has, you know what I mean, is playing, you know, very good rugby, her dream, I'm sure, would be to, you know, play for her country and to get paid for it. But, you know, success drives sponsorship too, you know, and that's a key factor when you are looking for sponsorship. And unfortunately in Ireland, we're not there yet. So it's a, you know what I mean, it's a different debate for us in relation to that.
And in terms of that integration that has happened over the last number of years, are you getting enough of a representation further up the track in the IRFU?
We do have representation, as I mentioned previously. We have our two co-optees onto the IRFU committee. We would hope in the future that there would be more. And I firmly believe that whenever there's a discussion around women's rugby and there's decisions to be made, that we need to be at the table. And I'm not talking about gender representation. We need people at the table that know what's going on the ground, know what's going on at a grassroots level, and I suppose who have walked the walk in relation to women's rugby. I do believe that the RFU, their governance structure is under review at the moment, and I think there might be a proposal in relation to the delegates coming from the branch, that one of those may be female in the future, so that would give us more representation. And sometimes we look at the top down rather than looking from the bottom up. So when we look at the people that are representative at the IRFU level, they have come from the clubs. They've been nominated by their clubs onto provincial committees, and from there they have made their way to the IRFU committee. So I suppose we need to work on our representation at club levels and have more women in the decision-making process and on committees at club level to bring those onto the provincial committees and therefore step up. The IRFU did introduce the leadership programme, which has been very successful, and we're due to start one specific for the women in rugby game in March. Unfortunately, COVID has put a halt to that, but we look forward to that next season, and that's about identifying people that will come to the game and sit on committees as appropriate.
I'll jump on the back of what Wendy said there. I think that's the biggest challenge about trying to get representation at the top end, so councils and board, is because I think our pipeline structure isn't very good, in the sense that, yes, we get people from our game at the very bottom, but the people who are coming in from the bottom in terms of our grassroots, the barriers are quite limited. So, you're not getting women in, you're not getting other diversity in. Instead, you're getting the same people on those committees at the lower end, at club level, and they're the ones who are making their way up to the top in terms of councils and boards. And that's where we need to change it. We need to widen almost that pipeline and find other access routes in, even if it needs to be a fast route, fast track route to get some women potentially into those roles.
Maggie, is it an issue that women administrators that come in at club level are only being considered for the women's game and they're not being considered for the wider game? Is that the issue?
It's quite varied. So the landscape in England is, I've seen some fantastic, there's some female presence out there, which is brilliant in terms of club level. Jill Burns is brilliant, what she does at Waterloo. So there's people who are finding roles that aren't just representing the women's game, but the general consensus is there are going to be women who have made it onto those roles, but they are only really there just looking after the girls and the women's section at the club. And that's a bit of a challenge because, again, they don't make their way through the pathway when you think about when opportunities come up at CB levels, so constituent body levels, where there's opportunities to progress further. No one picks them because no one sees them. So we just need to do a bit more and trying to, first, I think we need to appeal to more women, people of diversity, to say, look, there's some roles out there at your club that would really, you could make a big difference. And then once they're on those committees, then push them to go into CB levels and then, progress further. We just need to do more to sell it, because at the moment, I don't think a lot of players or volunteers know of their opportunities, and actually it doesn't really appeal to them at the moment.
We also have to call it out. I mean, Maggie, you and I talked this week about the RFU Council, and I know there's loads of work going on around kind of diversity in the game here, but what is it, 6 of 56 council members are women? I mean, that's just unacceptable. And also, World Rugby Council, again, I refer to something I wrote. I said something about there are more Bretts than women on that council. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And so we have to keep calling this out, and we have to keep putting pressure on, the status quo. And back to the kind of what I was saying at the top about, how many decades we're catching up on. Sport structures and NGB structures, including all of those around governance, were set up, by men for men, because that's what was happening in the sports when they were established. So, part of the work we do at Sport England is looking, we've got a governance code here, and we put targets a few years ago around women, so 30% of sports boards need to be, to be female. And, that's a very blunt instrument, but it does work. And you get, you diversify the conversations happening around the table, and it doesn't necessarily need to be about women's rugby. As you said, Keith, it needs to be, the kind of perspective that women bring to an issue is different in many cases. And there's pressure on Sport England now, rightly, because of the Black Lives Matter conversation of recent weeks, to add a target to BME inclusion on board. So, absolutely, we got to change the structures and help people to find a way up the ladder that isn't there now. But we do need to use platforms like this. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to come on here. You got to keep banging the drum. And I'm sure people are sick of listening to me banging on about inequality in women's rugby, but without it, nothing changes.
But even if you look at some of the Trailblazers that have been in the game and Joy Neville in refereeing, the more visible she is, and the fact that she's reffing men's matches, and should be, because she's a bloody good ref. It's nothing to do with gender in that instance. It's just the fact that she's very, very good at her job. The more evidence that happens, the more likelihood it's going to happen again.
Yeah, and I think, what happens there is that I hate the word normalizing, but it starts to become common and people stop talking about it and it just becomes part of the fabric of the game. And I think there's a really interesting thing happening to how the public feel about women's involvement in sport and in rugby, which would be considered, very male kind of in its origins. People really love, they have a real deep connection with their women's teams, particularly as Wendy talked about, the successful ones. I don't know if people saw the story this week around in Australia where the national women's teams took out the top 4 spots in the survey that said that the public had the strongest emotional connection with those teams, and women's sevens was third. So there's a real kind of moment and sea change coming, I think, for women in sport, whether it's on boards, in playing, visibility and refereeing and so on, and we're coming for it. So it's things are about to change.
Maggie, you're one of the half dozen. Sorry, Wendy, I was just going to say to Maggie that you're one of the half dozen on that council then with the RFU. How did you go through that process from ending being a player, and so many players have strong thoughts on how the game should be run and probably fade away into the background? How did you manage to stay involved? Are there stepping stones there to help females who are coming out of the game to move into that level, or was it just sheer personal will to get yourself to the top?
So I guess when I came out of the game way back in 2015, which feels so long ago now, I'll be honest, there wasn't anything there really for players to find their way back into the game as a volunteer or any form of governance and so on. So I guess I came out of the game really, like most players do, just really wondering, what am I going to do? I still love the game so much. I really want to help the youth coming through. I really am passionate about diversity as well. But look, my initial focus was actually I need to pay the bills. So I guess I found a way into broadcasting and I absolutely love it. And I guess to add on to a point that Ali's really highlighted, it was all about, for me, visibility. So I was very determined to do well in that area, especially being a woman. Didn't necessarily think about a woman of colour, but I just wanted to be somebody on there who could keep pushing, I guess, the women's game, or female players. And then just by chance in 2015, obviously Jason Leonard was the president of the Rugby Football Union during the Men's Rugby World Cup, and he contacted me and just said there was an opportunity on the council to be a national member. Would you like to take that role on? So, for me at the time, I hadn't thought about wanting to be on the council. It didn't really necessarily appeal to me. I quite like the life of being in broadcasting, being on TV. But not until he sort of approached me about it and realised actually the impact that I could have, I didn't really actually appreciate that I could actually do this. So I was like, yeah, I'll definitely be up for taking on this role. And then when I got onto the council and I got to meet the other councils and council members, I really realised it was such a welcoming environment. But I also realised that I was finally in the room and I can have those challenging conversations and start banging the drum, really. As Ali's already highlighted, it was all about trying to push certain things forward. And I've been on the council now for about just over 3 years. I've still got a bit longer, but obviously the terms will, at some point, my council member term will come to an end. So I really want to make sure that I can go as far up the ladder as possible. And one of those goals is to hopefully one day be RFU president, really. And I just think we need lots of change. The council want to create change, and I want to be part of that process.
It's a great point, a really important point there, Maggie, is that idea of co-opting. So if you're trying to make significant change and you have to put 20 years into the club and the province and everything to try and get there, change will come incredibly slowly. Whereas if you have people who are forthright and very capable, like we know each other for years, you're never shy about fighting your corner. You're going to be able to say your piece. There has to be an opportunity for that to happen, and it can't just be for the sake of having a couple of people co-opted on. But equally well, it can't be just having 30 years of service that gets you there, for the fact that you're the last one standing that gets you into some of these council positions. So the co-opting area is essential for rugby to continue its change in compliance and governance.
I definitely think so, and it's an interesting topic, because actually you don't want to upset the people who are currently at the top, but at the same time you've got to create change, you've got to disrupt somehow, and actually co-opting is a really good way, and that we've seen with the World Rugby Council and how much of a change that's been since they've added a lot of women on that, and I think it's made such a big difference. I do think, you know, we need to think about how our other councils and other governing bodies also formed and what the structure is. And I know, obviously, Ali's already highlighted, you know, Sport England are going to look to potentially revise the code of sport governance, because that might change things as well in terms of how a council and a board is formed.
Wendy, from the Irish point of view and having the voice in the room, it's been interesting looking at the back pages, and maybe it follows on from what Ali was saying, that it's the Premier League that dominates, and there's very few women's stories today. But when we talk about IRFU cuts, and we were in contact with the IRFU, and they say obviously budgets are still very much under review as to how the women's game will be affected. But all the conversation around cuts has been dominated by the professional men's players, and they have a very strong voice in the room with Rugby Players Ireland, and that is going to be the focus for the next 3-4 months. The thought that they may have to take a 10 or 20% pay cut, and the longer term impacts on grassroots as to what may happen in the women's game. Do you feel in Irish rugby that voice is in the room when those decisions are going to be made?
I think it is, and I think it's up to us to make sure that our voices are in the room. We can't leave that, you know, up to anybody else, that we have to keep knocking on the door and asking those questions. As a result of the 5-year strategic plan, you know what I mean, it has led to funding to secure that we reach those targets, and it has led to an increase of development officers in the province. Here in Munster, doubled our staff that were developing the women's game. One would hope that that funding is ring-fenced, because if we were to regress back to the position we were in 12 months ago, then there's going to be a regression in the numbers. If we don't grow the numbers at grassroots level, then you're not going to see that, you know, develop onto, you know, provincial teams, national teams, and lift the standards that are currently there, and the performances are there. So I think it's up to us to keep asking the questions in relation to all of those aspects in terms of funding, and to make sure that, you know, the funding isn't cut. There are going to be cuts. It's going to be cuts across the board in relation to, you know, all walks of life, everybody in employment. You know what I mean? COVID is affecting the world, but we'll have to deal with it as best we can, and make sure that the cuts aren't made to the women's game, because it'll be a huge regression if they were.
Can I ask if there was one thing each one of you would like to see changed, what would it be?
God.
Ali, you go first then, go on.
I don't know. I mean, I have 100. I mean, I think because I write about the global game, I think I really want to see progression in the kind of global calendar for the women's game. So we've got a really disjointed setup and system. We've got a quite, you know, a Six Nations which isn't very well balanced, much less balanced than the men's Six Nations. Again, a tournament born out of an idea that this was a competition that was, you know, run by men for men, and it isn't really working anymore. The window doesn't work. You know, arguably the teams don't work, and so I would really like us to be, you know, and I know that World Rugby are doing this with national governing bodies and so on, just looking at a very different calendar for women's rugby at test level that gives people opportunities to play teams who are you know, at the same level of them more often, but also brings up the rest, because there's just too much disparity now. I alluded to it earlier. I mean, England as a pro team, and they were already one of the best teams in the world. It's just very difficult to keep up with a team that's being paid to train professionally, and you know, so I think that for me would be huge. And I know that World Rugby were close to announcing something, and then COVID hit. So I'm really interested to see where they've gotten to.
And Wendy?
It's a tough questions. Like Ali, there's so many things that you want to change. I suppose if it was one, it would be representation on the different committees, both at provincial level and at an IRFU level, and to have more of a voice at those. I suppose that would be the one thing that I would like to change, that I'd like to see in the future. We mentioned about visibility there being very important, and it's, you know, it's key. We need our young girls and our young women to be able to see that there is a pathway for them, whether it is coaching, refereeing, but also representation at a higher level at the higher tables. And that would be the one change that I would like to see happen. And I suppose COVID has given a chance for reflection, and it has allowed time, you know, for that planning process and for us to ask questions. You know, and the one positive that I see is that we can attend meetings from our homes, which is a big plus in relation to not having to travel, you know what I mean, which would be a big aspect. You know, when you're asking people to sit on committees at a higher level, you're usually asking them to travel to Dublin. You know, if you're working full time, then that's hard during the week. So I think that's a big plus that has come out of COVID, but that is the one change, I suppose, that I would like to see. I'd like to see more representation on the different committees.
And Maggie?
So I love both what Ali and Wendy have said. I mean, mine was very much around what Wendy's really highlighted about representation in influential positions, you know, on councils, on boards. I think that's massive. I guess to pull out from that, the biggest bit is visibility. You know, it's hearing those stories, it's sharing their concerns, it's addressing those challenges. So it's visibility of those who are on councils and boards or in roles of influence, but also making sure we keep making those players visible as well across globally. I think that's really important. And by that, I mean players who are obviously performing well, but also players who are doing broadcasting and so on. Just keep making them visible, because I think that's going to be quite key to inspire the next generation, but also to ensure that we stay in the limelight and ensure that conversations are being had and that want to involve us as well.
Yeah. Can I just add to that, I suppose, just to mention, because it is an important milestone, I suppose, in terms of rugby in Ireland, that like next year we'll have Anne Hennigan, who's going to be president of the Connacht branch. The following year we'll have Debbie Carty, she'll be president of the Leinster branch. I mean, if we had been having those conversations, you know, 5-6 years ago, that we would have had female presidents of those, you know, those branches, you know, we'd be astonished. So there are two positive milestones that are happening, you know, in the next year and the following year, and hopefully the other provinces will follow suit.
Oh yeah, there's been enormous progress. I mean, I started Scrum Queens in 2009, and you know, where the game, I mean, firstly, I wouldn't have even imagined things like the Olympics happening and having women's sevens players there. Pro players, I didn't think that would happen in my lifetime. So, you know, change can happen quickly if there's momentum behind it, as Wendy's pointed out. And I think the thing that is really interesting about right now is that there are huge opportunities. We talked about some of them, but you know, one area we kind of haven't touched on, which I'm quite excited about, is sponsorship. So Maggie mentioned that Tyrrells have obviously ended their 3-year deal with the Premier 15, which is not ideal, right? And you could say, what a terrible time to go to market. But actually, I think it's the opposite. I think it's a brilliant time for women's sports to be going to the market, because very often it's cheaper. You get more engagement from the players, because you know we're not so bound up in women's rugby around, you know, the traditional models of sponsorship. So Keith, I know you've been involved in that side of rugby before, and I was the head of comms at WASP for years, where you know, I was quite surprised at the way the sponsorship model worked. It was very sort of, give us the money, we'll put you on our shirt and on the screen at the match, and off you go, and here's a box. And I think that's changed in sport, but women's sport, where you know the players are, you know, working and doing other things, we've just got this great product. And what I worry is that the unions aren't very good at selling it, and let's see where we get to. But certainly, you know, there's a huge opportunity coming in the next year to get that investment that we haven't seen yet into the women's game, because the pace of change is massive.
And I think the fear at the present moment in time, and I do agree, I think it's a cracking market opportunity now for companies to sponsor at a much lower level to rugby, to get their foot in the door, to then try and build something. Because if you can build something over a long period of time, that's pretty amazing. But it's whether the funding will be there for women's rugby in general. That's the big fear, I think, post-COVID, as to what are the ones that are going to be knocked over to try and secure rugby for a future.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're an NGB, like Wendy talked about cuts, I mean, yes, there are cuts coming to you know, governing bodies for sure. There are lots of redundancies on the way. You know, we're heading into a deep recession in most of the countries that the game's played in. So what I hope for, I mean, I would love to see ring fencing. I feel like it's not going to happen. I feel like most sports will say, we will not disproportionately cut our women's spend, and that is probably the best we can hope for. And I suppose there has to be some understanding when it comes to that. But yeah, I mean, the thing that is good is that there's pressure on NGBs now to actually protect their women's spend and to grow the women's game. That pressure didn't really exist a few years ago. You know, the kind of the momentum that we've talked about throughout this conversation, that hasn't gone away just because COVID happened. I mean, people remember how they feel when, you know, I'm obviously speaking from an England perspective, but when they watch the Lionesses, I think 11 million people watched that match last year when they played the semi-final in France. You know, that created something that hasn't gone away. So there is good pressure on the unions now not to be seen to be cutting, you know, women's programs and women's spend. So let's hope that does, you know, that stays, and that we keep the pressure on through, you know, having conversations like this.
The IRFU have their Women in Action plan, and they sent us on the numbers, and they're almost at 2,000 adult players with an aim of getting towards 5,000, and that's up, I think, 50% year on year at this stage. So they're certainly making signs of progress. I'm wondering, from that sponsorship point of view, Ali, and you're looking from another side, as to whether we have capitalized on success previously. And I know there's always a danger of reading into just the elite team's result, but you look at that successful Grand Slam side, and there were so many inspirational figures there who are still around, and the likes of Fiona Coughlin and Jenny Murphy and Niamh Briggs, who were very recognizable figures. And all right, results on the pitch haven't been able to continue. But looking from afar, do you think Irish rugby has capitalized on the success of that generation and of that team?
No, I don't think they have. And there are lots of factors here. That team was, there was a core to that team who had been together for years and years and years, and a lot of that started to dissipate. You know, players started to retire, have children, etc. So there were mitigating factors there. But the decline in the kind of women's program between 2014 and 17 was shocking, actually, despite the fact that people were really, you know, really interested in it. And you can't stand still. You have to move forward. You know, when there is momentum, you have to start capitalizing that. And sometimes that means investment. Sometimes that means really smart strategy, willingness to engage, etc. And I do think some of those things were missing, actually. But I think generally in the women's game, it hasn't been brilliant at selling the women's game and at really kind of building the momentum behind it. That is true, but there are some things you can say have gone really well. So I went to the England-Wales game at the Stoop. I live 2 minutes from the Stoop, so walked down there with my 3-year-old. There were 10,000 people there who had paid to go to the match, and that is a huge moment for the women's game, because the tickets tended to be free for these things. I mean, in New Zealand, I think this is true, actually. I'm not just saying things that aren't true. I'm pretty sure this is accurate. No one has ever paid to go and watch the Black Ferns. They either have free tickets on the back of double headers, or the tickets are given away. So they've got a really interesting marketing challenge generally ahead of the World Cup next year. But paid for, I'm going to part with my cash to go and watch this. That's been really significant moment in the women's game this year that people kind of glossed over. So yes, it's true, Ireland and other countries have not been very good at telling the story of the women's game and selling it to either sponsors or the public. But you know, despite that, the game seems to be growing anyway. So, you know, sort of you take with one and you give away with the other.
Another important aspect there, you mentioned some of the players that have now, you know, to be retired, I suppose, from Irish level, is keeping them in the game, because I feel like they are the face of the game and they're the faces that are known. And we've used, you know, I mean, those players and brought them through the coaching structures. So they're now coaching within the province. Hopefully they'll go on to be national coaches, but they're still the faces that are known, you know, in the media and do a lot of the reporting. So for our young girls who are now being coached by the Niamh Briggs, the Fihés, you know, the Marie Kellys, the Laura Guests, you know, those players that have played representative rugby, is very important for visibility, as we've mentioned earlier, but also showing them that there's a pathway beyond rugby, that if they do decide that they don't want to continue playing into the adult game, that there are other avenues that they can stay involved in the game and give purpose to it.
Yeah, and I you know, I probably get in trouble for saying this now, but I just don't think the RFU has been very good until recently at you know, pushing the women's game in the direction it should have been pushed in. There's still very much a you know, be grateful that we're including you. Now that is changing for sure, but there's still a hangover and legacy of that. And 2,000 adult players is great, but the numbers are pretty small, and the club game is still quite small despite all the great work that's been doing. I mean, if I were the RFU, I would be begging people like Lynn Cantwell to come and work for me, because we have some really smart, clever women who understand structures around women's sport, what motivates women to play, who understand rugby and who want to be involved and aren't. So you know, there's progress being made there, but there's still a lot to do.
Yeah.
Ali, is there a position for the Irish government in this? Is there an urge to try and drive increased participation among young girls into playing sport? Is that essential for this as well?
I mean, I guess Sport Ireland are the body through which that is done in Ireland. And I although they're the counterpart organisation to the one I work for, I don't know, all of the things they're doing. I mean, I know Lynn, for example, is the chair of the Women's Committee as part of Sport Ireland. So they are doing that. So I guess that's where the government come in. But, we just have to keep pressure on. We have to keep saying it's not, if you're an NGB, you represent absolutely everyone. And it doesn't, it's not just about the gate receipts that the men bring in. Your role is to grow every single aspect of the sport.
It's interesting you mentioned Fiona Hayes there, who often works with us on Off the Ball and would cover as many men's matches, if not more, than she would women's games, and is a brilliant analyst and well-researched and very thoughtful and knows the game inside out. I'm just wondering, Maggie, from your point of view, when I talk about being a voice in the room, that you don't just want to be a voice, I guess, for the women's game either. While you have a huge interest and a passion and you want to elevate it, that we need to get to a level as well that you're just another voice, that actually you can add to the overall grand plan of an RFU or an IRFU, that we get voices in the room that are just part of the furniture.
Definitely. It's one of my biggest things whilst being on the council. I don't just want to talk about women, rugby issues or BAME issues. I do want to be part of the fabric and talk about the men's game, challenges they're having at the moment with salary caps as well. So it's an overall discussion, and I think it's important that when we are in the room that we are trying to contribute to everything, not just the particular areas that we are going in for. At the same time, I still need to bang those drums, because if I don't bang them, no one else is going to. So it's a bit of both really, but we do need to make sure that we're looking at the whole game. Like, I want to represent the whole game, not just particular areas.
All right. I think we've got through a lot. There's obviously a lot more we could get through as well. Just to wrap up, if we're back in 12 months' time, 5 years' time, for you, Maggie, what success? Where do you want the women's game to be? Have you markers that you can judge it by?
I guess in 12 months' time, hopefully it will be in a Rugby World Cup in New Zealand. So I guess for me, what would be a mark of success is first seeing the Women's World Cup getting good sponsorship, but also good viewing figures. That would be huge for me. And the visibility of the game really being put out there. What would also be success for me would be seeing in lots of those councils and boards across many different governing bodies that there's more women and greater diversity. I think that would be also a big step forward. And then I'm probably going to go down the point that Ali mentioned around sponsorship. I want to see sponsors really starting to back some of those women's leagues, really putting their name to women's sport. I think that would be really big for our game and would really help grow it.
Wendy?
I suppose I would echo a lot of the opinions of Maggie. In 12 months' time, we'd love to see more representation, as I mentioned previously. I'd like to see more competitive rugby, at a national level, and that we're competing with the other countries in relation to, Six Nations. If we, are lucky enough that we would be able to go ahead with the full Six Nations and have a competitive inter-pro series. I suppose for me, because I'm working at a provincial level, the growth of the game is hugely important to me, and that we have the correct structures in place at club level so that they're sustainable clubs, so that they can keep going into the future, and that it's not just a group of girls training in a corner of a pitch, that they're fully integrated and they're representative at minis, youth, 14s, 16s, 18s, and go on to produce like an adult team. And hopefully from that they'll have representation at a Munster and Irish level, and that would be success for us, within the province.
Ali, have you a list of 100 here as well?
Well, no, they've taken all the good ones there. I think just to be different, I'll say that I'd really like to see the momentum from next year. So next year's a huge year for the women's game, the Olympics and the World Cup within basically 3 months of each other. Women's sevens at the last Olympics was really a quite significant moment. So I think building on that, getting as many brands, sponsors, commercial investors interested in the game as possible, and actually using that 3-month window as a springboard for greater things. And I'd also say, given I write about the sport, much better media kind of representation of the women's game, much better understanding, more coverage, etc. So that Scrum Queens wouldn't need to exist anymore, because I only set it up because nobody else was bloody writing about it. And now, sorry to use that word, but now, it still has a need. It's getting there, but I'd be very happy to turn it off. And hopefully we'll, in 5 years' time, I won't need to be doing it anymore.
All right, great stuff. Keith, have you any thoughts to sum up?
No, girls, thanks a million for coming on. It's very thought-provoking, and it's interesting because you always take a perception from your own self and you don't take it from somebody else. So we don't want this to be a one-time only offer. We want to get you on more often and get your voice heard more often. So thanks a million for coming on.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Been brilliant. Maggie Alphonsi, Ali Donnelly, Wendy Keenan, thanks a lot for joining us in State of the Union.